Buenas tardes tengan todos ustedes. A nombre de la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras de la UNAM y del Seminario Universitario de Historia, Filosofía y Estudios de la Medicina, les damos la cordial bienvenida a esta conferencia que va a ofrecer el doctor Kapil Raj. Antes de introducir al doctor, quisiera que el doctor Jorge Linares nos diera unas palabras de bienvenida.
Muchas gracias, querida Ana. Buenas tardes, es para nosotros un gusto tener esta conferencia aquí, colaboración con el Seminario de Historia de la Medicina y estrechar estos lazos y ofrecer al público de la facultad, que siempre es muy variado, muy diverso, una conferencia de altísimo nivel del doctor Raj, que ha venido invitado por el seminario a distintas actividades académicas en la universidad, y es un placer para nosotros recibirlo en esta aula magna llena de historia y de tradición en la universidad. No lo puedo decir todo en inglés porque no sé cómo, pero bueno, quizá le pueden traducir al doctor un poco nuestro agradecimiento. We'll thank you, Dr. Raj, for being here in this historic aula magna in the center of the university city, in the historic buildings of the School of Philosophy and Letters of the UNAM. Welcome and thank you again.
Gracias, doctor Linares. El doctor Kapil está tratando de aprender español, así que le vamos a intentar que haga el esfuerzo. Gracias al doctor Linares, en realidad él es el causante, el organizador de que estemos el día de hoy aquí. Bueno, el doctor Kapil Raj está en la Escuela de Altos Estudios en París, en Francia. Él estudió matemáticas en la Universidad de Delhi, en India, y luego hizo un máster en filosofía también en la misma universidad. Él luego se fue a Francia a estudiar con la hija de Gaston Bachelard, con Suzanne Bachelard, hizo su doctorado. Es que Jorge y yo conocemos bastante la obra, a lo mejor ustedes conocen la obra de los epistemólogos, conocida como la Escuela Epistemológica Francesa, que básicamente son Bachelard, Canguilhem y luego Foucault. Bueno, estudió con Suzanne Bachelard, que fue su tutora de tesis, que se trató sobre el concepto de ciencia en Habermas y en Kuhn. Posteriormente, bueno, él ha estado ahí desde entonces. A partir del 2001, si creo haber leído bien, ya formó parte del cuerpo de la escuela como profesor investigador de la Escuela de Altos Estudios en el Centro Alexander Coiré, y es autor de múltiples obras, entre las cuales nada más quisiera mencionar su libro Relocating Modern Science del 2006, que ha sido traducido incluso hasta el japonés, junto con Simon Schaffer y Lisa Roberts, perdón, editaron un libro que se llama The Brokered World, The Go-Betweens and Global Intelligence, y tiene múltiples capítulos escritos con colegas en volúmenes editados y también en revistas académicas. Me congratula comunicarles que una de sus coautoras en uno de estos capítulos soy yo, que acabamos de publicar un capítulo para un libro de Springer, que el doctor Linares ha sido invitado a presentar algunos de los capítulos, ya les avisaremos. Pero bueno, este es el doctor Kapil Raj. Él vino por una estancia de 3 meses, está dando un curso de licenciatura y posgrado en la Facultad de Ciencias. Los que quieran asistir, las reuniones son los lunes en el auditorio Carlos Greff, hay espacio ahí para todos, y realmente es un curso muy interesante que se llama Science in Society and the World. Sí, ¿verdad? Sí, le atiné, exactamente. De 1900 al 2000, y bueno, está siendo realmente muy interesante el curso. Y bueno, sin más, le doy la palabra. El título de su conferencia está aquí atrás, es muy parecido al título del libro que les menciono. Y pues otra vez, muchísimas gracias. Many thanks for being here. You are very welcome.
Muchísimas gracias, both of you. Yeah. Jorge, Ana. And that's the end of my Spanish. I can't speak more Spanish than that.
Better than English?
Yeah. Ah bon.
You should have spoken French.
Oui, seulement que les autres ne vont pas comprendre dans ce cas-là. Oui. Well, thank you ever so much for this invitation, and I'm really honored to be here in the School of Philosophy because, as Anna said, I have a science background, but I have a thesis in philosophy of science. And so in a way, although now I'm an historian, I still have very deep links and relationships in my own work with philosophy. So without any further ado, let me start.
We are going to move Jorge and I to see the
Yes,
presentation.
of course. It's much better to be on the other side.
Un vaso de agua.
Sí. Is it better now? Okay. So I'm going to talk to you about connecting worlds, basically. How a world's connected. So, on a cold and wet afternoon in November 1766, the stagecoach from London came to a halt in Oxford's Market Square. A banal quotidian happening that would have gone unnoticed had it not been for the fact that there emerged from the coach a passenger who was not quite like the others. Sporting a long, dense black beard and draped in a blue robe with a vermilion sash, a multicolored turban, and a fine cashmere shawl, this man was Mirza Sheikh Ittizamul-Din, who was born around 1730 and died around 1800. So he was the envoy of the Mughal emperor, the emperor of the Mughal Empire in India. And he was sent to the King of England, George III, to protest against the exactions of the employees of the English East India Company who had just conquered a part of his empire, which was Eastern India, Bengal. Now, so it was with a request to reestablish order, because the English were doing what the Russians are doing in Ukraine right now, roughly. So, this man, who is a member of the literati elite of Eastern India, and he had been selected for his diplomatic acumen, acquired as an agent of the East India Company during the latter's negotiations with the kingdoms west of their newly acquired territories. Now, having arrived in London in September of that year, so this is November when he is in Oxford, and just 2 months before that, he had arrived after a 7-month sea voyage from Calcutta on an English East India Company ship, disembarking in Nantes in France and traveling the last leg to Calais via Paris. He had expressed his desire to visit what he called the great madrasa of Oxford, of which he had always heard so much. And he was hosted, amongst others, by Thomas Hunt, who was the Laudian professor of Arabic and Regius professor of Hebrew. Now, Hunt, in turn, introduced this Mughal dignitary to his best student, William Jones, who was to gain fame later in life as the foremost Orientalist of the 18th century, and the person who was to invent the idea of comparative linguistics, and also of the idea that there is a family of Indo-European languages. So he's called, in fact, the father of scientific linguistics and comparative philology. So, during his month-long stay at Oxford, Ittizam al-Din was shown the observatory, its collections of astrolabes, orreries, and, he says, a large telescope to contemplate the 7 heavens and 12 signs of the zodiac and investigate the influences of the fixed stars and the planets and of every sign. But it was basically the university's numerous libraries that truly captured his attention, especially the Oriental treasures they held. Since many of these writings were inaccessible to the local Orientalists, because many of them, they had all these documents, but no one knew how to read them. So the Mirza translated a number of Arabic, Turkish, and particularly Persian texts, mainly diplomatic missives. As he says, at that time, there was nobody in England who could read the latter language fluently. And for this reason, the purport and meaning of these papers was not truly understood. And in every place, there was a mark of doubt. They showed me them, and I read them with facility. They likewise, in order to examine me and try my abilities, put different books into my hands according to my capacity, and I explained their meanings and sense. Now, at William Jones's request, he also translated the 12 rules of the Persian language and grammar from the university's copy of a grammar book which was called the Farange Jahangiri, which is a dictionary of classical Persian written by the great Mughal linguist Hussain Anju from the 17th century, the previous century. Now, we know all this because Ittizam al-Din actually wrote his travel account. It was called the Shigurfnama-e Velayat, which means the wonders of Europe. And in this description, he gave an account of all his travels in Europe and Britain, and it was written about 20 years after he returned, and then it was translated into English in 1827, and it became a bestseller. Now, but, in spite of the fact that he knew what these people were doing, and they were trying to test him, they were getting information out of him, all these people in Oxford, the academics. But he said for all his shrewdness, he knew exactly what was happening. He was nonetheless taken aback when William Jones lost no time in transforming his translation into a Persian grammar book, which is here, for the use of the employees of the East India Company, because Persian was the principal language of the Mughal Empire, and thus of the newly acquired territories. And because people needed to know this language, he made a lot of money, says Ittizam al-Din, and he says because this is a very celebrated book. So, of course, he didn't know that it was his own writing that this man had plagiarized and then published and made a lot of money out of it, but he recognized it. Of course, and although Jones, for his part, did not cite Ittizam al-Din by name, he did acknowledge his debt to an anonymous aristocrat, in all probability Ittizam al-Din, in the preface, and I quote from the preface of the grammar. He says, "I take a singular pleasure in confessing that I am indebted to a foreign nobleman for the little knowledge which I have happened to acquire of the Persian language, and that my zeal for the poetry and philology of the Asiatics were owing to his conversation and to the agreeable correspondence with which he still honors me. Now, this experience undoubtedly played a role in his recommendation to the readers to have a native speaker, because in the same preface, he tells readers it's okay to have a textbook, but you also need a native speaker of the language by your side, and from whose mouth you can learn the true pronunciation of every letter, and who will explain to you the common words, the refined expressions that occur in reading, and will point out the beauties of learned allusions and local images. So in a way, from my course, I'd like to point out that this also has to do with tacit knowledge, which you cannot gain from writing alone. Now, this account actually quite neatly sums up a number of aspects of the intellectual relationship between the British and South Asians. Through the circumstances that brought Ittizam al-Din to Britain and played a crucial role in William Jones's primer in Persian, we see the close links between knowledge, scholarship, trade, and empire. It also puts paid to the notion that Europeans were the sole producers of knowledge, even if it was often based on elements garnered from what they call indigenous informants, that was subsequently diffused to the rest of the world. Instead, this anecdote brings out the complexity of knowledge flows, the nature of which can only be understood within a long-term context. The Mughal aristocrat Ittizam al-Din had already worked with or for the Europeans, like many other South Asians had done over the 2 centuries before him, ever since the latter entered the Indian Ocean world. Now, but more significantly, however, than this straightforward mathematical asymmetry and the term collaboration might suggest, William Jones's recommendation to his readers to seek the services of a native speaker point to the inevitable condition of Europeans, and of all strangers, for that matter, of being epistemologically dependent on indigenous populations in order to accede to the knowledges and practices of the culture they initially interacted with and progressively colonized, thus making the latter indispensable intermediaries or go-betweens. Now, and this is a very good illustration of an Englishman in the 17th century who's lost in a forest, and there's a little boy who's pointing out, no, you have to go this way. So it's not just an informant, it's much more than that. And while my examples come from my part of the world, from Asia, you can very easily substitute these for the Mexican experience of the early conquest and later. A typical example of this, I mean, not only is La Malinche, one of these go-betweens, but you have, after the conquest, you have this whole enterprise of the relaciones geográficas. And that, again, is epistemologically dependent on a number of intermediaries, officials of the different administrations, empires, and so on, of what was later to become Mexico or New Spain. So, I mean, you can easily make this transfer. However, scholarship on this genre has predominantly focused on accounts by European travelers and the way in which they went out and reported the world through their representation of the other. So you have, for instance, Tsvetan Todorov, The Conquest of America and the Question of the Other. It's always, the European is the knower. Marie-Noël Bourget, La Collecte du Monde, Voyage et Histoire Naturelle. Again, so it's collecting the world and bringing it into the Natural History Museum in Paris. Or Juan Pau Rubies, travel and ethnology in the Renaissance, South India through European eyes. Or Jas Elsner and again Rubies, Voyages and Visions towards a cultural history of travel. But the traveler, the actor, is always just the European. And of course, and even though there has been a burgeoning interest in non-European travel accounts, these narratives share the same general assumptions as their traditional European counterparts. So instead of having the European travel outside of Europe, now you have non-Europeans traveling to Europe, but it's the same thing, you know, so they look through their own eyes and there's no question of intermediaries. Whereas the story that I told, the anecdote, shows that it's not all that clear at all, because even Al-Tazam al-Din needs other people to tell him what's going on. And it's through their eyes, in fact, that his vision is actually being made. So let us see how we can actually then conceive of this exchange. And it's not only these texts, there are a few others that point to a framework which could perhaps help us understand what's happening when cultures actually meet and how these meetings take place. And what are the epistemological, sociological, anthropological dependencies that are created, and what are the conditions by which a connection can actually take place. So, one of the books that actually set this field is by Mary Louise Pratt, and it's called Imperial Eyes, Travel Writing and Transculturation. It was published in 1992. And in this book, which, by the way, is a very bad book, but it has one nugget in it, and it's for that nugget that it's still worth looking at. And that nugget is on pages 6 and 7 of the book. After that, you can throw it out, but still, you require the introduction. And in that, Mary Louise Pratt actually defines something which is extremely useful for us. And that is what she calls a contact zone. And she defines it in the following way, I quote, she said, it's the space in which peoples, geographically and historically separated, come into contact with each other and establish ongoing relations, usually involving conditions of coercion and radical inequality and intractable conflict. A contact perspective emphasizes how subjects are constituted in and by their relations to each other, often with radically asymmetrical relations of power. So it doesn't mean that an encounter and a meeting should always be a meeting between equals, sitting around and chatting in a salon in Paris and discussing freely. No, there are inequalities, there are asymmetries, but in spite of that, there is a negotiation and a new space is being created. As I said, it's a bad book because unfortunately, after that, the rest of the book is all about how Europeans dominate the other there's no place for the other. But actually, she starts by saying something which is interesting, and so we can take that and then use it quite seriously. But she, of course, was not the only one who talked about this. Mary Louise Pratt herself is a linguist, and so I suppose that's one of the reasons why she couldn't actually come to terms with the anthropological aspects of this encounter, although she saw it. However, historians, also quite independently of her, at about the same time, things were happening. So in the beginning of the 1990s, another extraordinary book which came out at the same time, just a year before that, is called The Middle Ground, Indians, Empires and Republics in the Great Lakes region, 1650 to 1815. Now, this is a very interesting history because unlike the way in which the history of North America is told, which is an annihilation of the indigenous populations by Europeans, this book actually shows, the Great Lakes region is around upstate New York, Illinois, Michigan, but also Canada. So it's the three, there's 5 big lakes in the middle of North America. And Richard White, who is a historian, actually looked very closely at the record for about, it's a century and a half, and really the crucial century and a half of the making of both Canada on the one hand and the United States on the other. And what the role of the Indian population is. So, and this is quite surprising actually, that the Indian population is extremely active in not only the making of the Americas, but also the making of a French mentality in France and also an English mentality in England itself. Because for this whole century and a half, there are all kinds of negotiations taking place, and the very identity of what turns out to be all of North America is defined in this region through this tripartite encounter between the French on the one hand, the English, and the indigenous populations on the other, especially the Iroquois. Another book which takes up this very, very seriously, this whole question of go-betweens, is Alida Metcalf, whose book, Go-Betweens and the Colonization of Brazil, 1500 to 1600, was published 15 years after this, in 2005. But again, over here, the idea of the go-between and the making. So for her, there are religious go-betweens, but there are also sailors. There are women, for instance, without whom it was not possible to colonize. And these women are not just, these are not Portuguese women. These are also a number of indigenous women, but also slave women, and how all this makes Brazil. So, I won't spend too much time talking about this. I'm just recommending some titles which have taken this idea very seriously, of the colonization of Brazil, where we hardly ever talk about the indigenous populations as to how important these populations are, but they're not the only ones. Of course, there are a number of others. Even, missionaries are part of this go-between, this intermediary category for her. But so are sailors. And so are slaves. But let's go beyond this to see how we can get out of these individual case studies. And one of the people another historian of Africa, who took this question up quite seriously and much earlier than anyone else, was a man called Philip Curtin. And he published a book which was called Cross-Cultural Trade in World History. Now, drawing on anthropology, economics, and history, Philip Curtin studied trade and exchange across cultural lines in world history. It's a classic work now. And he has convincingly shown us that trade diasporas have always transcended the barriers of locality and parochialism to link together widely separate parts of the globe, starting from the premise that no human group could invent by itself more than a small part of its cultural heritage and its technical heritage. He adduces a plethora of examples of cultural transfer across human history to argue that the external stimulation provided by trade diasporas has been the most important single source of change and development in art, science, and technology. In so doing, he has opened the door to examine the crucial need for mediation brokerage, and cross-cultural communication in establishing sustained exchange between disparate and different cultures, and the role that cross-cultural brokers or go-betweens have played in the context of a subject of increasing academic interest over the last decade or two. Now, it goes almost without saying that third parties, labeled variously as passeurs culturels, culture brokers, or go-betweens, were invariably at hand, holding this disparate whole together, so to speak, ensuring the passage between the varied languages, customs, accounting techniques of the merchants and those of local communities of producers and suppliers, and influencing long-term interactions in new and fundamental ways. These intermediaries were designated by various appellations. From my part of the world, for instance, in Arabic, you have the word dalal. In Turkish, it's terjuman, but terjuman in English gets translated as dragoman. It's an English word, which means an intermediary. Meturgeman in Hebrew. Dubash in various Indian languages, but especially in Persian. And so you can carry on. In almost every language, you find that there is a name for an appellation for these communities of intermediaries who help actually bringing things together. So, and one of the people, of course, who actually quite theorized on this was one of the founders of the domain of sociology, someone who we don't actually talk much about, because when we talk about the founding of sociology, we talk basically about two people, Emil Durkheim and Max Weber. But the third in this trio is also Georg Simmel. And more and more, we are now coming to his writings. He's a difficult person to actually read for the simple reason that he wrote only one big text, in which was called The Philosophy of Money. But other than that, all his writings were in short essays, some of them only 3 pages long, but they give us a lot to think about. And so amongst these essays, there are a few which are really very, very important for thinking about this idea in abstract terms. As I said, I do have a philosophical background, and I don't want just to think about things purely empirically, but also to have some sort of a theoretical background and basis for thinking about these go-betweens. And in particular, he wrote these 2 essays, which are again very short. One is called The Isolated Individual and the Dyad, and the second one is called The Triad. Now, these were published in 1908, at the very beginning of the 20th century. And Georg Simmel's idea is, his basic theory is, that the individual cannot exist. For an individual, you already have to have someone else in order for the individual to even think of their individuality. The individual, in fact, is always in relationship to another. But he says he goes beyond that. He says, if you were to take, then in other words, the world, if you were to take in terms of a dyad, so 2 people making up society, he said that is not possible because 2 people do not get along with each other. And he takes the example of the family. He says the couple, they can get married, but they need a child because, in fact, it's the child that keeps the parents together. Because otherwise, they would break up. basically, it is always this third party that holds the other two together. And he gives us a typology of the kinds of third parties that we might have. One is a mediator between two people. The other one is the arbitrator. In other words, someone who settles disputes between people. But he says there's also the tertius gaudens. In other words, someone who takes pleasure in causing problems. So, the producer of conflicts. So, so there's basically, it's not just someone who's nice and brings things together. It's much more complicated than that. Now, and lots of people have, taken up this idea of the third person. One of them was the great anthropologist Clifford Geertz, who was looking at the making of Indonesia, because that was his basic terrain. And he talked about the Javanese Kijaji and the changing role of the cultural broker, because it's this Kijaji who was the central figure between the organization, the village organizations of all of the islands that make up Indonesia, and the central government. And of course, the Chicago School had a lot to say about this in terms of, so you have all these different people. And today, this idea of the go-between has been taken up also by management and business administration people to show how important brokerage is in the making and the learning networks within an enterprise. So it's a very fruitful domain. However, the emphasis is now shifting to the interaction between mobile figures and the cultures that they encounter, examining the negotiations, inflections, and reconfigurations that result from this process. And here are a few texts. Espace et technologie dans la France méridionale, d'Ancien Régime, and how the Indianage, which is prints, cloth prints, and which come from India, and how these designs are actually incorporated into French textile, in the French textile industry. Then you have Mimi Scheller and John Urry about the new mobilities paradigm. Sanjay Subramaniam, Three Ways to be Alien, Travails and Encounters in the Early Modern World, and then Courtly Encounters, Translating Courtliness and Violence in Early Modern Eurasia. So just a few examples. And as far as the idea of go-betweens goes, it's not only with respect to Asia. You also have Berta Ares Queja and Serge Gruzinski, Entre dos Mundos, Fronteras Culturales y Agentes Mediadores. And Louise Benatachot and Serge Gruzinski, Passeur culturel, Mécanisme de métissage. And Serge Gruzinski, The Mestizo Mind, The Intellectual Dynamics of Colonization and Globalization. This, of course, is also available in Spanish, since Serge's main terrain was Mexico at the time, just after the conquest. And Scarlett O'Fallon and Carmen Salazar Soler, another book from Peru. So this is Passeur, Mediadores, Culturales y Agentes de la Primera Globalización en el Mundo Ibérico, published in 2005 by the Catholic University of Peru in Lima. Now, I'd like in the remaining time to actually look at an example to show you how this works in detail. So a case study. As I've already said, that basically I'm a microhistorian. I look at case studies, and it's through that I can think and try and go beyond and look beyond the case study. So my case study is from the 17th century in South Asia, which becomes India. So, can you? Yeah, you can see my arrow. Yeah. Okay. So this is the Indian Ocean, and this is the Indian subcontinent. And my example is from this region, from this place here, which is called Cochin. And it is a book that is published between 1678 and 1693. Its so-called author is a man called Hendrik Adriaan van Rede tot Drakenstein, a Dutch nobleman. And the book in question is called the Hortus Indicus Malabaricus. It's in 12 volumes. And so it was in the 1670s that in response to a request for an inventory of local fauna by his superiors in the Dutch East India Company in Amsterdam, that the civil and military commander of the Dutch possessions of the Malabar coast in southwestern India, Hendrik Adriaan van Rede tot Drakenstein, whom you see over here, 1636 to 1691, had a gigantic work commissioned on the flora of this region. So why suddenly did he receive this order? Because, just a little few words about Cochin. Cochin was the first territory to have been colonized by the Portuguese in 1503. So Vasco da Gama, before Goa, 6 years before he colonized Goa, had already established himself in Cochin. And 160 years later, in 1663, the Dutch ousted the Portuguese and established their own territory. They took over from the Portuguese. And Hendrik Adriaan van Rede was sent as the military commander of this region. Now, the thing is, why did the Dutch suddenly want to know more about this region? Well, for one thing, the Dutch, if they colonized, and if any of the Europeans colonized anything in Asia, it was in order to get into the spice trade, basically. That was the most interesting thing about Asia. The pepper, cinnamon, cloves, etc., nutmeg that came from Asia. And Cochin was the capital of the pepper trade. Even today, that's where most of Asia's pepper is actually produced. And by the 17th century, it was also one of the major producers of cashew nut, which had come from Brazil. No, cashew. You know the little nut? No? Cashew? Huh? You know? Ah, okay. The little moon-shaped nut. Yeah, which comes from Brazil.
It's not from India.
Oh, no, not at all. It's not from India. Exactly. I mean, now you think it comes from India. Exactly. Like you think mangoes come from Mexico. No, they come from India. Even the word mango is an Indian word, yeah. It's manga. Yeah. So, see, this is the whole thing about globalization and how. Yeah, but it's not just global trade. This doesn't happen. There are intermediaries in all this, and that's the point. Yeah, that's one type of mango. Yeah. It's called Manila. Yeah, that's one of your mangoes. But it's an Asian mango. Yeah, exactly. So anyway, and so when the Dutch colonize this part of the world, they want an inventory of everything, because if the Dutch, they are the biggest traders in the 17th century in Europe of any kind of goods that come from anywhere. They've displaced the Venetians, who monopolized the trade in the Mediterranean, the Genovese and the Venetians, and they are the ones who now control all the trade. And what they're looking for is different new things as well to trade. That's one aspect. But the other is, and this is very important, which is that in the Indian Ocean, at any one time, by the time they conquer Cochin, there are at least 10,000 Dutch seamen in ships around all over the Indian Ocean. And these people need treatment because many of them are ill. There is a death rate of 40%. So, public health is a crucial aspect. And public health at that particular time means knowledge of herbs, quite simply. That's where, till the end of the 19th century, that's where most medicines come from before the pharmaceutical industry. So for all these reasons, he's asked to make a catalogue. And so he says, making inventories of the region's plants and drugs and their uses was an important part of European activity at the time of direct contact between South and Southeast Asia. Now, some of the best-known examples of this are already the Portuguese classic text from Garcia da Horta, which is called Colóquios dos Simples e Drogas de la India, and which was published in 1563 in Goa. And there are lots of others. There's the Tratado de las Drogas y Medicinas de las Indias Orientales, which was by Cristóbal da Costa, and et cetera, et cetera. And I won't go into all these things, but it's still very important to see that there is a whole genre of literature, and this text is part of that. And so the first volume is published in 1678 in Amsterdam, and this is its frontispiece. We'll come to this frontispiece in a little while, but before that, I'd just like to show you some of the inside of this, its contents, these 12 volumes. It is a classic text because it is the text on which all of Linnaeus's classification of Asian flora is based. And even till today, it is a reference it's the fundamental reference for the flora of southwestern India, even till today. These 12 volumes contain a description of 791 plants of that region. It's enormous. And this is the inside. So these are the engravings. You see over here, this is a palm tree. And here's another example of a palm. Here is another fruit that we have. This is called the jackfruit. The banana, the papaya. This is called nux vomica. Okay, so in Latin. And so nux vomica, if you translate into English, means the vomiting nut. Yeah, and yeah, exactly. And so this relates to early modern medicine, where the best way of getting rid of any illness was by any form of removal. So through all the orifices that we have, you had to eject things, and if you couldn't, then there was trepanation. You made holes in people's brains and heads, and then they had to, so liquids, then everything had to come out. And the nux vomica was the most valuable and the most commonly used substance. It is also the basis of strychnine, if you know, which is a deadly poison. Huh? See. It also comes from this, yeah, but strychnine is something that Agatha Christie uses a lot in killing people. So, these are just some illustrations that I wanted to show you. There are 790 illustrations like this. And it's absolutely extraordinary because you see that these are amongst the first botanical illustrations. You have the plant, you have its fruit, you have its flower, you have a cross-section of the seed over here at the bottom, and you also have the flower separately, the bud. And you see this in almost all of them. You know, over here again, you have the papaya, you have a cross-section, you have the flower, you have the same with the banana, you have the male and the female banana. And in every, but also another thing that I'd like to remark is that in all these drawings, you have the names of these plants in various languages. So in the Latin transcription, it's called ambapaya. It's also called papaya. Then in the different scripts of the region, again, you have the name. You have the name in Arabic, in 2 different languages, and then in the Brahmini script of Sanskrit. So in all of them, you have the same thing. Over here, in each of them, you know, it's the same sort of thing, but not always the same number of names, because sometimes you don't find names. So, and now, when you open the first volume up, you know, what you find is, in the beginning, you find this page. So you have the frontispiece, you have the title page, and then you go beyond the title page, you flip, and you see something very odd. You have an engraving of a text in a funny language, and then you have a Latin translation of it, and it tells you, it gives you the Latin translation, it tells you who translates it and how it's translated finally into Latin. So, as it says, but we'll come to this a little later, as to what is this about. You flip the page again, and you see yet another text of the same kind, another engraving, and again the same thing, hoc est, with a Latin translation and a number of names that come beneath it. Flip the page again, and here again you find another engraving, and again the same structure. of Latin and a number of signatures, and then you come to the end of this. Now, what is this? And what is the place of this in a botanical manuscript? So, here is the first. I'm going to show this in greater detail. Just this bit. Now you see that it's written in a strange language. Now the strange language is Malayalam. This is the language of Cochin. But it is signed in Latin. And the signature is Emmanuel Carnero. We know nothing more about this for the moment. Let's go to the next one. And the next one again, look, I mean, it's a funny script. You can't understand it. But if you look closely, it's not the same script as this. This is the first one. This is Emmanuel Carnero. This is the second one. And it's slightly different. But here the signature is not in Latin. We go to the third one, and here you can see already that the script is not the same at all. It's a different script. And here there are 3 signatures. It's a collective document. Now, what is all this about? So let us try and translate this into English first. So if you read it, it says, the English translation is, I, Emmanuel Carnero, a Roman Christian, a native of the city of Cochin, interpreter under oath of the Indian Society, as per the order of Governor Henry Rede, so Heinrich von Rede, explained and interpreted from the Malabari language into Portuguese the names, medical powers, and properties of trees, plants, herbs, and creepers growing in these Malabari territories, as heard from Kolada, a Malayali genteel doctor of the Chego race, a native of Karapuram, and written in the book of the Malabari doctors, in testimony of which I wrote these and signed, given in the city of Cochin on the 20th day of April, 1675. Manuel Carneiro, he signs. Then it says below that, translated from the Portuguese language by me, Christian Herman von Donep, Civil Secretary of the city of Cochin. So you see over here already, there's a first intermediary, a man called Emmanuel Carneiro, who says that he's translating things from the works of a native doctor into Portuguese. And then there's another person called Christian Herman von Donep, who translates from the Portuguese into Latin. I'll tell you a little more about Christian Herman von Donep in a little while as to who he is. So already we know that Emmanuel Carnero, although his name is Emmanuel Carnero, is not Portuguese. He's a local Christian of Cochin, in other words, converted to Catholicism by the Portuguese, but he is the local public translator in the administration. And you can see this sort of thing. You can transpose it to Mexico. You'll see exactly the same sort of thing of people translating from, say, for instance, their Nahua texts and going into Spanish. And you have all these people who might have Spanish names, but who are really local, from local tribes and communities. The next one is actually the text from the Malayali doctor that he speaks about, who then says, I, Itti Achidan, a Malabari doctor, Chego by race, and by race they mean caste. Casta. Gentile and native of Karapuram, or the place called Kolada Karapalli, inhabitant of the house called Kolada, who was born of great-grandparents, grandparents, and parents who were physicians or doctors, and testify that I came to the city of Cochin as per the order of Governor Henry van Rede, and through Manuel Carneiro, interpreter of the Noble Indian Society, told and dictated names, medical powers, and properties of plants, trees, herbs, and creepers, written and explained in our book, and which plants I had observed by long experience and practice, that this explanation and dictation went on without any doubt, nor would any Malabari doctors doubt about the veracity of all the things I said. I made these, which I wrote by my own hand and signed, given in the city of Cochin on the 20th of April, 1675. Again, Itti Achudan, a Malabari doctor, translated from the Malayalam language into Portuguese by Manuel Carneiro, and from the Portuguese into Latin by me, Christian Hermann von Donep, Civil Secretary of the city of Cochin. Now, the third one is in a different language, and so these are affidavits. So I swear, it's a legal document. These are 3 legal documents. So this one is so it says, from the year 1595, called by the Brahmins, Palikapattu, which for us is the year 1674 of the English calendar, of the European calendar, to 20th April of the year called Rekekau, which for us is 1675, we, Rangabhat, Vinayak Pandit, and Apu Bhatt, all 3 of the Brahmin race and religion, and doctors in the district of Cochin, as per the order of the noble Lord Henry van Rede, governor of the Malabar territories and the city of Cochin, through our servants, who have knowledge of trees, plants, herbs, and creepers, caused them to be brought to Cochin from the Malabar regions with their flowers, fruits, and seeds, in order that they may be drawn and described as per their medicinal powers and properties contained in our book called the Mahanighantam, or the Nighantu, to which we have added whatever we have learned and observed by long experience, also examining the names of the medicines, and with great labor and sweat, so that this book may be completed, we have worked for the space of almost 2 years, for all to read and see with the same faith as we had experienced this themselves. We swear, therefore, according to our custom, that all that is contained in it is true, in testimony of which we have prepared this document and signed with our own hands, given in the city of Cochin on the same day, the 20th of April, 1765, Rangabhat, Vinayak Pandit, and Apu Bhatt. And again, this is translated, but this time not by Emmanuel Carneiro, but by Vinayak Pandit from what he calls the language of the Brahmins to Portuguese, and from Portuguese it's translated again into Latin by Christian Hermann von Donep. Now, what is happening over here? So, while this book, on the one hand is a European book, it's authored by Henry van Rede, the moment we open it, Henry van Rede himself tells us how the whole thing is being constructed. And the reason he tells us this is because he knows that he is a military man. He left Holland at the age of 13 and has spent his life at sea. He cannot tell Christmas from Thursday as far as plants go. He knows he has no knowledge of plants. So if this book gets published, people are going to ask, who are you? What do you know about these plants? How did you get all this information? So immediately he comes clean. no, it's not me, it's all these guys across over here. And this is the credibility of the document. Now, of course, it's not enough because he doesn't say that he doesn't know anything about plants. So when the first 2 volumes get published, the reviews are terrible. People say, who the hell are you? I mean, where have you come from? What are you talking about? What is all this? I mean, this might come from the moon, it might be someone's imagination. What is the credibility of your document? So in volume 3, he writes a new preface in which he comes absolutely clean. He says, yes, of course, I mean, I know nothing about plants. It's not my domain at all. But let me tell you how I got this. So it's over there that he starts by telling us exactly who all these people are and why this is so important. And in this, of course, he has to say that, that he's still the commander. So on page 8 of that preface, I haven't given you the text over here. What he says is that by my orders, Brahmin and other physicians made lists of the best known and most frequently occurring plants in their languages. On this basis, others classified the plants according to the season in which they attracted notice for their leaves or flowers or fruit. This seasonal catalogue was then given to experts in plants who were entrusted in groups of 3 with the collection of the plants with their leaves, their flowers and fruits, for which they even climbed to the highest tops of trees. 3 or 4 draftsmen who stayed with me in a convenient space would accurately depict these living plants as the collectors brought them. To these pictures, a description was added nearly always in my presence. So it's not him. He's just there. He's supervising, basically, at the best of times. But so who are all the different people now? So who are the 3, Rangabhat, Vinayak Pandit, and Apu Bhatt? Who are these people? So these are 3, and we know about this because we know who they are from other records. These are 3 of the biggest traders in plants. They themselves are doctors from Goa. They speak a different language, but they're here. And they have the monopoly of trade of all plants for the Indian peninsula, for all of India. They're the ones, so they're the biggest merchants in town. Vinayak Pandit is, since he comes from Goa, he's perfectly at ease in Portuguese, but he is also the foreign minister of the king of Cochin. So he's a central figure. And they say, oh, we sent our men out, we sent our servants, they fetched everything, and then we classified all this because they're the ones who know what's what. And their servants have to go out and fetch all these plants, in any case, for the market. We know that Itti Achudan, for instance, is someone who is a doctor from, he says, from the Chego race. And the Chegos are people who climb coconut trees and palm trees and bring down the fruit. But they are also the community that distills alcohol from these. And because they distill alcohol, they know about distillation and about how from different herbs you can make medicines by combination. So these are the people you go to get medicines made through distillation. So now we have a good idea. And who is Christian Hermann von Donep? Christian Hermann von Donep, in spite of his name, is again a local. But he has been to school, to a Dutch school, where he's taught Latin. So he doesn't know, I mean, he has a lovely Dutch name, but he knows no Dutch, he knows Latin. And because it's through, and he knows Portuguese. So because the Portuguese have been there for 150 years, 160 years. So everyone knows Portuguese. So you see now how languages as well are part of this idea of the go-between. It's not just human beings, it's also languages that are moving around. And now I come to the end of this, which is that through all this, we realize, so it's not as if we need, you don't need to be a detective. You actually, if you can read a text carefully, you see how within the text itself, you have a lot of information, because people are not idiots. Europeans, it's today that we think that Europeans go around all over the place and, they're great and they can pick up stuff. But if you read the Europeans themselves, because other Europeans are not going to believe them. I mean, who are you? How do you know anything? I mean, you can't even move from Paris to London. You have no idea what's happening. So how, when you go to the rest of the world, suddenly, magically, do you understand things? And you've always got detractors, people who are trying to pull you down. So, and there's a lot of competition. There are lots of other people. So you have to, in a way, justify and legitimize your account. And it's by reading carefully that you begin to realize that this justification is a process in which you have to actually bring to the fore, make visible all the networks and the intermediations that go into the making of this knowledge. And this is why it's so important to study these documents carefully and to see how the world is actually being connected. So it's not connected. It's not as if this is connected histories. This is connecting how histories are being made through the making of connections. Now, you see over here also that these connections, everyone is not equal. Itti Achudan, the doctor, is of a lower caste, and he cannot write, he's not allowed to write in the same script as Manuel Carneiro, who is of the upper caste. Manuel Carneiro uses a script which is called the Arya Ethadu, and this one is the popular script of everyone else. So if they can read and write, they have to write in a different script. So already we have all these differences, and they're all there in the manuscript to show us exactly how this contact zone is functioning. But also these intermediaries are not intermediaries who come, they're not travelers. Because normally we think of intermediaries, Europeans as being the intermediaries. They're traveling around here and there and they can do things. But this is a work of translation. And here I would like to quote from a French philosopher called Michel Serres. And Michel Serres, in a book which he wrote, which is called La Traduction, which means translation, said the following. He says, translation is a process of making connections, of forging a passage between two domains, or simply as establishing communication. It is an act of invention brought about through combination and mixing varied elements. And Michel Calon, a sociologist and contemporary of mine, says translation involves creating convergencies and homologies by relating things that were previously different. We're actually inventing. So translation is not as if you have two languages. You have one language and you have a recipient language, and you just see how things, flow from one to the other. These are not just homologies, They're also, more than that, they're convergencies, and they actually relate things. So there is a whole process of creation, of invention, of innovation in the process of translation itself. Now let me come back to Georg Simmel and to a very short essay that he wrote, again, at the same time in 1908, which was called The Stranger. And in this, so I'm not going to read out the German to you, but its translation, which is, if wandering, so this is the traveler, this is the European traveler, considered as a state of detachment from every given point in space, is the conceptual opposite of attachment to any point. So you have you have the indigenous person who hangs around, doesn't move, and you have the traveler who's always moving around. And he says, then the sociological form of the stranger presents the synthesis, as it were, of both these properties, of someone who is stationary and someone who's always moving. He says the stranger is actually the synthesis. And why? Because he says the stranger is thus, the stranger being discussed here, not in the sense often touched upon in the past as the wanderer. The stranger is not the wanderer who comes today and goes tomorrow, but rather as the person who comes today and stays tomorrow. Because you have to stay in order to be able to recognize what's happening. And all this volume actually shows to what extent the intermediaries, the go-betweens, is not someone like Van Rede, who's there, who comes for a while and then goes away. But it's all these other people. There's a sedimentation of go-betweens, of intermediaries who are there for longer periods, who get to know cultures quite intimately. And yet they're strangers. They're not just a local population, and they're not just a traveling population. And you have to have this idea of being there rather than moving around. So it's not the mobility paradigm. It's more than that. It's also a knowledge of the place that matters. And it's with this that I close, just to see how go-betweens also require much more of an intimate knowledge than what we have when we move around. And so the impossibility of the European traveler who can then know. So the epistemology requires, this, the knowledge itself requires familiarity and distance at the same time. So I'll stop here.
Gracias, Professor Kapil. Many thanks. So we have time for questions, please. While people are thinking, may I? When you were talking about microhistory and the idea that studying a case and then go beyond that to see the bigger picture or the whole picture, it reminds me Canguilhem's idea that the history of science is a laboratory of epistemology.
Yeah.
Is that what? See?
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Can you say something?
Yeah. Well, the whole, again, for Canguilhem, mm-hmm. his cases, he is a doctor. He's looking, his whole epistemology is constructed around case studies. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And this is very, very important. Now, the whole question is, what do you mean by a case study? Is any old case equivalent to another case? And in all these, even in Canguilhem, there's the question of the choice of cases. Mm-hmm. What choice, what case do you actually choose, and what is the importance, what is the significance of the case? Mm-hmm. As it is for Freud as well. It's not any old case that you pick up that becomes significant. For it to be significant, it has to have more than that. And for me, my significance also comes from the fact that the cases that I choose are already recognized to be important for the history, for instance, of botany. This one, for instance. You know, this is not just any old person hanging around somewhere or the other, and then you say, so what? What do you do with this? Do you need 50 million cases like this? In other words, it's like a jigsaw puzzle. If I give you one piece, what do you know about the rest of the jigsaw puzzle? So then in order to make the whole thing, you need a number of pieces. Whereas over here, it's important to know that the choice of the case is such that it will shine light on everything else. It is historically, it's a historically and epistemologically significant case. And that is what, I mean, for Canguilhem, in his own writings, this is what he also reflects on, you know, the choice of things. Because otherwise you go into generalities. You need the specific case, but the specific case has to be significant. And what is the significance? Yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, as a matter of fact, for me, you know, on the one hand, I'm so far away from philosophy and epistemology. And yet, it is my formative years, reading all this and assimilating it, that have also helped me to be a historian, finally. And move away from epistemology, but still be very close to it.
Jorge quiere preguntar algo.
Sí, comentario breve. I remember when you're talking the book of the general history of the affairs of the New Spain from Fray Bernardino de Sahagún. We know that that book was built with informants, native informants. I suspect that it's the similar case of this story, because this book contains a history of the conquest and many information of anthropological cultures, traditions, techniques, also knowledge of the plants and many facts for interest for the conquerors, and also the translation. For example, you mentioned the Malinche. Yeah. Malinche was for the indigenous peoples the union, the binomium between Marina and Hernán Cortés. Yes. Dual people. And Malinche has the control of the translations and the knowledge of the diplomacy and the high diplomacy and interventions in that epoch. The general history of the New Spain was published in 1576.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And I maybe we need to read these books in another key for the construction of that you have show us.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons for me to talk about this over here, because again, it's an understudied part of let's say, of Hispano-American history. Because even Serge Gruzinski, when he talks about the passeur culturel, he could include this, but he doesn't. For him, unfortunately, there's an irony in all this, that although they start by talking about these phenomena of interculturality, the interculturality finally only moves in one direction. It moves from Europe to New Spain, to exactly, to the colonized people. But what happens in the other direction? Because there's a transformation also in the other sense, and something new is being created over here, which is not the old. And one good example of this is the Relaciones Geográficas of also the 1670s, of the 1570s, sorry. Now, it is made because of a demand by the King of Portugal. But the King of Portugal doesn't know what he means by this, because there is no original text in Spain which corresponds to the Relaciones Geográficas. He wants something, he wants a catalogue, but he doesn't know what he wants. He just wants to know what there is. What is this territory? What does it comprise of? So finally, in its making, in fact, it has just so much of Nahuatl culture, of administrators of the empire, of the Aztec empires and other empires as well. Because these are people who are administering, and they too are responding to something which they don't do themselves. They don't make these pictures, they don't make, no. But so it's a way of translating something which is a vague demand into something more concrete. And the net result is a text which is completely original. We call it a hybrid, but it's not a hybrid. A hybrid means that you have two originals from which you have a third. No, this is something which is a completely new translation of it's a new idiom which is being formed, just like this. There's nothing that you can go on. It's not as if there are past, classic texts like this that exist. No.
Preguntas, sí, Joel, Marta.
Okay, thank you very much for your conference. And I was wondering if we have the historical cases and we have identified go-betweens in this creation of knowledge and these new spaces of new contact zones and everything. But can we go further and can we talk about history from below, like social history has been doing in the 1960s? I mean, can we think that we are giving voice to the other, or we have to just be cautious and stop at the level of the go-between? Can we give people from the below to the poor populations and the way they know things, or we just have to stop at the go-between level?
It's a very, very interesting question, and a central question. The point is, that we live in an asymmetrical world, okay? We would like to know more about the history of common people, what was going on. But as an historian, we have a basic problem, which is that our source for history has been overwhelmingly the written text. Of course, in the past decades, a lot of work has been done in order to retrieve the past through oral sources. And the history of Africa has been very important in this, especially Jan van Sina. And the idea that there's orality can also be historicized. Now, the point is, still, whatever it is, we are handicapped because the richness of the wealth of the written text is enormous. And the written text is basically a text either of elites or else texts which are made in early modernity through intercultural encounter. That's where texts come in. It's not only with Europe, but it's also, say, for instance, between Arabs and India, between the Chinese and India. It's, things get written in this intercultural encounter, whoever it is. Of course, it's predominantly, it becomes European because of the place of Europe in the making of the early modern and modern worlds. So then the problem arises, how do we retrieve this culture? And we have to then read European texts or other texts, Chinese perhaps, or Arabic or Persian for us, against the grain and try and see what we can pick out, like what I'm doing over here. But you can do it much more sophisticatedly. I'm just a historian of science. So my domain is much more limited, but people have done this. And one of the people who has done this in a way which was not meant for Europe, but, which was not meant for the rest of the world, but for Europe, is Carlo Ginzburg. So Ginzburg has done a lot of research into pulling out the common person from texts that common people don't write. From the Inquisition, for instance. From the records of the Inquisition, you get to know a lot about the way people are working. But you also get to know a lot about intermediaries and go-betweens through that. So I can't say that you have to stop at that. What I'm saying is that you can get to this level of intermediation. But after that, if you want to get to other levels, you have tools. For me, I stop here because this is what I am looking at. I'm looking at, as an historian of science, I'm looking at the construction of knowledge. That is what so I have an epistemological point of entry. Is how is new knowledge being made? And is new knowledge just being made within confined communities who think in the same way, who have the same sociabilities, the same civilities, the same idiom? Or what happens when they meet others? And what is this new knowledge that's being constructed and how is it being constructed? And that's why go-betweens for me are really important. But that doesn't mean that we stop there.
Gracias. La hilera de... Sí.
Hi, thanks for your talk.
Está apagado, creo, no se oye.
In a similar way to the last question, maybe in other way you put the question, you talk about this sedimentation on one hand, and I thought in Mexico case, like the Creole people, that they are Europeans in origin, but they stay here, and maybe their parents are Spanish, but they have this idea, this local idea. And I think that maybe they are part of this elite, and we can have studied their ideas in a similar way. We have their writings, and maybe we don't have this lack of sources, and maybe this idea of the question, how we can know the ideas of these people. Maybe they are part of the empire, but they are here. They have an own view. And I think that this is related with other question. If you think that this knowledge that you are looking for is always in part of the empire, it's a vision of the empire and for the empire. Because I think that, as you said, both sides make new knowledge, but we usually take the part of the empire, it's easier to knowledge. But I don't think that that's have to be the way always. And only for finish very quickly, I want to ask you if you know the word, the term, the idea in Nahuatl called Nepantla, that is something similar. It's like a state between, that's something in the middle. And the indigenous people use it to describe their position between the Spanish ideas and the Nahuas. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, this is also partly, coming back to your question as well, the previous question in answering this, which is, again, I mean, I'd like to stress on one point, which is that I am not trying to retrieve old knowledge. So it's not as if I'm trying to see what is the knowledge of, the popular knowledge of the region. For one thing, I hope to have shown that there is no such thing as a popular knowledge. You have the knowledge of, say, for instance, these three big doctors who come from the north, who are settled there, whose knowledge is based on Sanskrit texts. That's what they cite. You have this other guy whose knowledge is a popular knowledge. But what he is doing is he's coming there and giving this knowledge which is already being transformed because of the questions being asked by Van Reyder. So it's not as if he's trying to just give you his knowledge, popular knowledge. It is within a framework, and it is also by the constraints imposed by these three other people. So what we get then is something which doesn't exist as such in the past. It does exist. I mean, there is a level at which it exists. It is his skills, finally, which he's using in order to make something for a new market and for a new demand. And that's why, for me, it's, I don't want to look at the intermediary as someone who just gives you access to a popular culture. He's not just translating a popular culture into a different idiom. He's making something new because of a demand. You do not translate, for me, I cannot translate gratuitously. It's not because you feel like translating something from one language to another that you do it. No, there's a demand somewhere. There's a market for which you're doing this.
But maybe my idea is that you could make the translate because the people need it. They take some issues from Europe, I don't know, and they make this translation, but not for empire, not to as asking for the empire, but because they need to do the translate too.
Yes, of course. Of course, there is that as well. I mean, things happen outside of empire. Not everything happens within an imperial framework. It's not as if there's one monopoly. There's a lot more that's happening. I mean, mine is a very narrow case, and I do not want to make this into the overwhelmingly important case. I just want to show through this the importance of these intermediary groups. Of course, it's not as if this is reductionist. It's not as if it can only be reduced to one dimension then. These people themselves also have a role to play. They're also taking their own initiatives. Of course. I mean, I am someone who works in this particular framework of interculturality between Europe and the rest. But it's not to say that this is the only place where this can be applied or should be applied. You're absolutely right. It's a way of looking at things which can be, for which there are many more dimensions. I would not say, I do not want to generalize. It's not as if there's a generalization, but there is there are a number of other dimensions, and you're right in pointing these out. Yeah. Okay.
Last question.
Yeah.
Could be both. Sí. Gracias. So thank you so much for your talk. It seems like spices and drugs are not equally distributed all over the world. It seems like
What?
Yeah, it seems like
No, what and what are not equally distributed?
spices and drugs, medicines.
Yeah.
So I'm tempted to think about coevolution and our domestication processes, but how does Dutch people interpret this kind of expertise and knowledge from the natives? Like, do they think about this as a discovery or as a creation? In other words, like, how do they see the relation between nature and natives, and how do they create this knowledge for them, for Dutch people?
Yes. I find Simel's idea of not existing individuals, but rather like a series of connections that makes us into being really interesting. But my question is about the these different dimensions that make an in-betweener, because it seems to me that there's still a vision of another, no, in this idea of the stranger or the in-betweener, and how I understood it. But when do we become an in-betweener? Is it something that, yes, when do we become an in-betweener? That's the question.
And the third question, quickly, yeah.
Sure, well, about my question, before making the question, I was just trying to mention how, because this came after a reflection I made about your presentation, I was thinking if probably in the formation of disciplines in science, like I was thinking, for example, in physical chemistry, how this can come to be after the work of an in-between. Like if we can maybe conceive the formation of these disciplines as a work of these type of in-betweens. Like I was even thinking if the possibility of this debate about the reduction of chemistry to physics can be derived from these asymmetries and this difference of cultures, if we can think about them in that way. And if you think it may be possible to apply this analysis of in-betweens to maybe the formation and development of these different disciplines in science.
Yeah. Okay, so these are three very different questions, and they would require a long time to answer. However, one of the first things that I want to say is that go-betweens are not, it's not a state. It's a function. You can be a go-between in a certain circumstance. Of course, there are preconditions to being a go-between. In other words, you cannot just be a stranger, a traveler, and be a go-between. So it's not like as if I've been here for 2 months, or I'm going to be here for 2.5 months in Spain, in Mexico, and then I can go anywhere in the world and be a spokesperson for Mexico. Oh, things happen like this, So if I were to write a travel account of Mexico and claim that that there is a truth content in that, that's the idea. I've been to Mexico. I've talked to Mexicans, and so I can speak for them. This is completely against that notion. It means that I can be a go-between, but it's a function at a certain time. At a certain place, I'm trying to do something which connects two different things, which can translate from one to the other. But in order to do that, I have to be more than just a traveler. I have to have a knowledge of both sides in order to be able to make that operation possible. And that's why I also think that, this idea, I'd like to take it up further if we can, outside, a little later, of how this works within disciplines today. One idea in this is put forward by Peter Gallison, which is his notion of what he calls trading zones. So he thinks that the coffee machine, for instance, around which people, physicists and chemists can come and talk to each other, and then you get a new discipline. So it's like a market, You go to the market, you look at fruits, you buy things, and then you take them away, and each side does that. And that's not the idea of the go-between at all, because in the go-between, there is much more than that. There is an investment in translating, and there is also the creation of a new space. In that space, it's not as if the chemist goes off and makes physical chemistry and the physicist goes off and does something else. No, there is the creation of a new space. It's a new discipline that's being created.
It's
And
like a crucible?
it's like a crucible. It's like a crucible, exactly. The crucible is not a market space where you come with your wallet and you pick up fruits and vegetables and then you go back home and do what you like with that. The person who's selling the stuff does one thing with it, you go home and do something else with it. No, that's not what happens over here. It's like a crucible where there's a transformation.
Mm-hmm.
And the crucible is a go-between.
Mm-hmm. Crucible es crisol.
Crisol.
Para los que
Sí.
se estuvieran preguntando.
See, and
Donde se funden cosas.
yeah. But, Lucia, your question I'd like to take a lot more time to answer. So we could perhaps do that.
Yes. Well,
Okay, at another time. Yeah, because as I said, it's...
over lunch.
Yeah, over lunch.
Over lunch.
Yeah.
We are very. If someone of you or Marta, whoever, wants to have lunch someday with Professor Kapil Raj, he's open.
I'm open.
He's open to do that.
Yeah.
I always say Kapil, but it's
Yeah,
Professor
Kapil.
Raj.
No, Kapil is my, like Anna is for you.
Yes. Well, many thanks. We have to go.
Thank
we
you.
have to pick up
Thank
some
you.
things.
Yes.
Thank you all for coming today, and feel free to approach. Not today because we are in a rush, but any other time. You can find him every Monday from now to the end of November, more or less.
And you have my email, so you can
Yes.
also write that.
Uh-huh. Please do so. Don't hesitate to do that.
Yeah. Thank you.
And thank you, Jorge,
Thank you.
for your
Thank you, huh?
for the
Thank you.
hospitality.